To begin by saying how nice it is to see so many of my old friends here in Cedar Club today, and also welcome to those of you who haven't joined us before. So I am a research forester with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station in Maine, and my task today is to provide an overview of the research that we've been doing with Cedar Club here in the U.S. And as Charles mentioned, we have quite a number of new folks today. So I'll begin by reviewing what we've accomplished in the past, and then I'm going to move on to some new findings that haven't been shared before and updates on work that's currently going on. So the work that we've participated in over the last couple decades covers the topics of regeneration and recruitment, cedar growth and decay, site relationships, old growth, silviculture and operations, and then more recently, insect pests and climate change. So I'm going to work through some of these and share highlights with you. I know that we can't cover everything, so if you hear something that seems interesting and you want to know more, please send me an email if we don't have a chance to address it during the question and answer. So I'm going to start with stand dynamics, and throughout the presentation, I've put the names of the folks who worked with me on these various topics on the slides and indicated whether they're in Maine and Quebec. So our work started with stem analysis, and this consisted of collecting 80 sound northern white cedar trees from across central and northern Maine and the Maybec Mill Yard in Quebec. And these ranged in size from pole timber to 22 inches in diameter at breast height. And what we found from this work is that 80% of those cedar trees showed initial growth suppression followed by release. So that indicated that they started growing as advanced regeneration. That period of initial suppression was more than 60 years on average, but the trees responded well to release, and some responded to release after more than 200 years. So this indicated great potential for silvicultural treatment. Wanted to just share a couple of radial increment graphs. We have radial increment in millimeters on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. And this is one of my most favorite to show. Some of you have seen these before. This is a tree that was 13 inches in diameter at breast height that we took from the Maybec Mill Yard. And what we see that at the time of this study, it was 356 years old. Well, it was dead then, but it had been 356 years old. This was just your regular run-of-the-mill tree out in the landscape in Maine. It originated in 1650, and it never experienced a growth release. It had continuously slow but improving growth over its entire life and was growing faster at the end than it had been the whole time. Here's a more typical radial increment for cedar, and here we see a period of initial suppression followed by a pronounced release. And so what this shows is that diameter increment in a suppressed condition was about 1 millimeter per year and about 5 millimeters per year after release. And that is representative of average growth rates that we've observed over the entire region from inventory data. So when we pulled these data together, we were able to show the number of years it takes cedar to reach a given size from stump height. And I want to just draw attention to two of them here, the pole timber, which would be 5 inches in diameter at breast height, and shingle stock, which was 15 inches on the stump. And what we found is that it took close to 100 years on average for a cedar to reach pole size and 170 years to reach shingle stock size. But what was encouraging to us was the range of years shown here, which was that you could grow pole timber in as few as 28 years or more than 170. And similarly, shingle stock trees could be grown in 80 years. And this was just from the sample that we had. So this isn't maximum potential growth rate, but certainly what is reasonable. And all of this really confirmed for us that cedar has the potential to grow well in a released condition. We further investigated the influence of site, and this study looked at 60 mixed species stands in central and northern Maine, and at each we investigated cedar volume growth and decay, and the site types varied by soil drainage as shown here on the bottom from very poorly drained to well drained. Our observations were that on average, cedar growth rates are similar to those of red spruce. It's slower than balsam fir, and growth is generally faster on uplands and seepage sites. Those are sites with moving groundwater than in swamps. We also found that logging damage was an important cause of decay. So it has been in the literature reported, and folks have observed that lowland sites seem to be prone to more decay than upland sites, but that effect can be overridden by past logging damage. So it was not uncommon for us to find uplands with a higher proportion of decay due to past logging than lowlands that had not had previous logging damage. We investigated cedar sapling recruitment here in central Maine on the Penobscot Experimental Forest, and at the time of that study, which was led by Catherine LaRouche from Quebec, there were 15 deer per square mile. She looked at number of partially harvested mixed species stands and found that between the 1970s and the 2000s, we had an 80% reduction in cedar saplings. We had recorded the cause of mortality for all of those in our historical records, and so we know that this was due to browsing, logging damage, and competition. Further, when we looked from the 1950s to the 2000s, we had a 95% reduction in overstory cedar. This was due to the combined effects of logging and low recruitment. So this suggested problems with sustainability of the cedar resource at this location because the saplings were dying and the larger trees were being cut. So key points from our stand dynamics work are that cedar often originates beneath the canopy and it's very long-lived and slow-growing. It can withstand long periods of suppression and is prone to recruitment failure. At the same time, we observed increasing growth over time and the potential for cedar to respond well to release, but it's very vulnerable to logging damage. So from here, we moved on to look at management and conservation, specifically focusing on the characteristics of old growth stands. This work was initiated by a request from our collaborators managing commercial forest land who were interested in the criteria to meet Forest Stewardship Council old growth criteria. So what I'm referring to here is that FSC guidelines in the US specify two types of old growth. Type 1, which is at least 3 acres that have never been logged and have old growth characteristics, and those need to be set aside. And type 2, which are 20 acres or more and have been logged, but they retain significant old growth characteristics. So the question was, what are the characteristics of old growth cedar? We see that cedar trees can be very old, even when they're not in an old growth stand. And many cedar trees are hollow. So how could you make this determination? Well, for this, we used 4 old growth sites in Maine and New Brunswick. Each had both old growth stands that had no history of harvesting and partially harvested stands. We also picked up additional partially harvested stands down at the Penobscot Experimental Forest. These were swamps and seeps, so lowlands, and what we found is that there was a significant difference in average tree size between the old growth in OG and the partially harvested in the PH. But this alone wasn't a good predictor because we know suppressed trees can be quite small. What was a very strong predictor was the amount of deadwood in advanced decay classes, where there was significantly more deadwood in the decay class 4 and 5 classes, and this refers to deadwood volume as determined from transects. So what this means is that the presence of large amounts of downed logs on the forest floor in a state which is characterized as very soft, easily penetrated by roots, the wood falling apart, the shape is collapsed, it's somewhat elliptical, the bark is nearly all gone and plants are growing on it. There's an example right there of a decay class 5. The old growth stands have volume of wood in these classes that isn't present in the partially harvested stands, and so this is a diagnostic characteristic. Furthermore, we investigated the dynamics of old growth stands with regard to natural disturbances because this informs the types of silviculture that one might do for ecological forestry, which could be appropriate in the type 2 old growth that have harvesting history but characteristics of old growth. It also is something that is gaining interest throughout the region as an approach to silviculture. So what we found through an investigation on Big Reed, Maine, undertaken by my colleague Sean Freever, he did stand reconstruction, so increment cores, and looked at growth patterns of the trees. The stands turned out to have multi-age structures, so many different age classes of trees, but low rates of canopy disturbance. And based on his reconstructions, he determined that the canopy was turning over at a rate of 6% per decade. So that's about 0.5% canopy opening per year. And periodic pulses happened that were up to a 25% turnover within a decade. Now that still averages out to no more than, on average, a 2.5% canopy opening each year. So these stands are characterized by small-scale natural disturbances. In addition, similar to what we observed across the broader landscape, he found that most trees experience multiple release events or persistent slow growth throughout their life. That's really the strategy of northern white cedar. This information helps to inform management decisions and certification compliance in the region where we did this work. We don't want to extrapolate those findings to other regions. And with regard to silviculture, it suggests that retaining large overstory trees and micro stands where coarse woody material is present would be a good approach to maintaining characteristics similar to those in old growth or unmanaged stands. Multi-aged management would be appropriate, and spatially variable treatment such as group selection or irregular shelter wood might be feasible to achieve all of those objectives together within the context of ecological forestry. So from there, we moved on to the topic of lowland white cedar, and this was a direct outcome of a Cedar Club meeting we had in Quebec some years ago, where we shared these results, and then folks said, well, we have questions about lowland cedar, because as you're going to hear shortly, the silviculture work done to date, which has been primarily in Quebec, has focused on cedar in a mixed stand or upland context. So we took this on, and it's really exciting in that we are shifting our focus with manipulative work from more mesic upland stands to those that are swamps and seeps. So these have seasonally high water table, thick moss cover over the forest floor, thick organic material as the soil substrate. This study is taking place in 3 locations in central Maine: Penobscot, Danforth, and Dyer. Now, I know there are places where there aren't a lot of cedar, or places where there are concerns about the ability to manage cedar in light of deer browsing. And while there are parts of Maine where we do have those deer browsing concerns, and Penobscot is one of those, there are other places where we have been successful in managing cedar. And with regard to the lowlands, this is a prominent site type in Maine for northern white cedar, which is the 5th most abundant tree species in the state. So northern white cedar management has been happening on commercial forest lands at a large scale, and there hasn't been the information that will inform the best approach to this. And so that was the motivation for doing this study. So my colleague Sean Freever put out sensors to monitor water table depth. We did this at a number of sites pre and post harvest. Here's an example from one of the sites pre-harvest. We see the water table depth on the y-axis and the month on the x-axis. And for the spring and fall, this just shows the not frozen times of the years, the water is less than 4 inches below the surface. Throughout the summer and into the early fall, the water table is lower. So this helps us to understand how wet these sites are and the constraint that might have on management. So we did our pre-harvest observations, and this was across 8 sites, 8 stands, pardon me, at our 3 different sites. What we found with regard to overstory composition and structure was live tree basal area of 170 to 260 square feet per acre. So these stands are carrying a lot of volume. The percentage of cedar was 70 to 80%, and companion species included spruce fir, red maple, birch, larch, and white pine. Snag basal area was high, about 20 to more than 30 square feet per acre. None of the stands in our study had been managed since the mid to early 1900s. The regenerating stratum, and here I'm referring to seedlings that are established, so at least 6 inches in height, but smaller than an inch at breast height, were 25 to 30% cedar, and up to a quarter of those cedar were browsed by deer. However, we got a different picture when we looked at the saplings and compared that to the overstory. So here's an image from one of our stands, and you can tell right away that that's not cedar in the understory. In fact, what we had is a condition across all our sites where the overstory was dominated by northern white cedar and the understory was dominated 70 to close to 100% by balsam fir. And this is a situation that is common in many cedar stands. We looked specifically at the mode of regeneration, and I'm just going to touch on this briefly, but cedar has the ability to regenerate asexually by layering. And it does appear that layering is prevalent in our study sites. I'm not going to go into that further now because my colleague Jay Wason will be giving a presentation about this, and it's really a fascinating aspect of cedar ecology and management. So I'll just mention that as an important factor that you'll hear more about shortly. We also looked at microtopography because it was very clear from previous work in the Lake States and elsewhere and our own observations that the pit, flat, and mound, as we call it, microtopographic positions had a real influence on where the trees were growing. So what we found is that cedar of all sizes, from regeneration to trees, were less abundant on the pits and flats than on the mounds. That's not a surprise. This picture, which was taken in Maine, shows that the pits are fully inundated with water and the flats were quite wet. In fact, although we did find seedlings on the pits and flats, there were almost no trees there at all. Cedar abundance on the mounds is also high relative to the availability of mounds. And so we had a pretty low percentage of stand area in mounds, but way more cedar there than you would expect. Oh, there's the numbers. So 35% of the stand area in mounds, 75% of the overstory trees growing on the mounds. So my colleague Sean Fravor did a planting study that we will be replicating this year elsewhere. His 2-year results from planting cedar 2.0 stock was that 80% survived on mounds, and these were protected from browsing, so that was not a factor. 80% survival on mounds, 62% survival on flats, and 12% survival on pits, which does not surprise me because I participated in the planting and was putting my arm in up to my elbow to put seedlings in some of those pits. There is a high proportion of downed wood on these lowland cedar sites, even the ones that have a history of management. So over, for example, at the Penobscot, 1,000 cubic feet per acre of downed logs covering 5% of the forest floor and yet supporting 20% of the seedlings. So a very important regeneration substrate. All of these observations on the ecology of the stands led us to develop a silvicultural treatment to explore. The one that we're using is an irregular shelter wood that consists of a thinning, which will also serve as an establishment cut due to the shade tolerance of cedar, that was a 20% removal of basal area, trees larger than 6 inches in diameter or breast height, and then gaps aiming to cover 5 to 10% of the area, 1 to 2 tree heights in diameter, so that's 40 to 80 feet. And we chose that gap size based on the work out of Quebec and upland stands that indicated that that was suitable for establishing and releasing small regeneration. We were anticipating 15% of stand area in machinery trails, resulting in a target removal of 40% of the stand basal area. And I do have some photos here of a gap on the top and the thin stand showing the trails after treatment on the bottom. Other considerations that we had were obviously winter operations during a frozen period. Protecting the regeneration safe sites by establishing trails in areas with less pronounced microtopography where possible. So that might be old trails that had already been kind of squished down. Avoiding machinery damage to decaying deadwood, as we know that is important for regeneration. And placing slash in the trails to minimize the site damage and the ground disturbance. We also plan a post-harvest cleaning, that is a pre-commercial brush saw release of cedar in the gaps. There was advanced regeneration there, but there's also fir, and the fir will outcompete those, we think, if we don't do some competition control. So far, 2 of our sites have been harvested. These are, well, 3, but right now I'm going to talk about 2. These were cut to length operations, both of them. The treated area is outlined in pink. The hashed green area is the control. The dashed lines are the skid trails, and the red shapes are the gaps. Surprisingly, this treatment in one was on down East Maine and one was in Central Maine turned out to be very similar. We removed 16 to 15 cords per acre overall, 11 to 12 of which were cedar. Both of them, we ended up with 25% area in trails. So the trails we originally laid in were expanded by the operator. We did find these to be operational. We did not have problems with site access on these, although we had to wait until we had a prolonged period of freezing weather, and the operators in at least one of the cases were working nearby on higher ground and able to move in when the site was suitable. We did have some difficulty with damage in the gaps at the site on the right. You'll see some of the trails go through the gaps, and even where they did not, the operators were felling and delimbing trees inside those, which was contrary to our hope, because that's where the advanced regeneration was that we're trying to release. That reflects the fact that those operators were unfamiliar with gap treatments to release advanced regeneration, and emphasizes the need for good training and feedback. When we look at the stand structure impacts of the harvest, what we found was a 40% reduction in live tree overstory basal area. So we had fewer gaps than we thought we were going to, because there wasn't as much advanced regeneration as we would have liked to have seen. So that compensated for the greater area in trails. So that's shown here. And we also had, surprisingly, a 25 to 40% reduction in snag basal area. And that was not anticipated. We did not mark any snags, and snags were not deliberately felled. However, in the process of cutting the trails and moving around the stand, those losses were incurred. Greater losses happened on the site where we had more damage in the gaps. So I think that just reflects a different approach to operating than we saw on the site that had lesser damage. One of the things that was of particular interest to us, and this is brand new data summary that we just pulled together on Friday for you all, is canopy cover. These lowland conifer dominated stands are very important for deer wintering area because they provide protection from the snow and the winds during times when it's really cold and hard out for the deer. So none of the stands in our study were designated deer yards. However, when we look at the canopy cover, it fell pre-harvest between 70 and 95% in all stands, indicating that they would be suitable for designation as primary winter shelter based on the criteria used by the state of Maine. After the harvest, at the removal intensity we used, we did reduce in the 2 stands that I show here, canopy cover to 60 to slightly less than 70%. These stands would then no longer meet the requirement for primary winter shelter, but they do meet the standards for secondary winter shelter, which is defined as being adequate in all but the most severe winters. So this is brand new work. We're looking at also relationships between overstory basal area and cover to see if we can get some better linkages there to understand how to manipulate the cover successfully for a specific target amount of cover in basal area. So that's underway, but I just wanted to share it with you because it seems quite interesting. Microtopography was a particular concern, and we had our distribution of area of pits, mounds, and flats here in Penobscot absolutely did not change pre to post cut. At the Danforth site, which was the other site I showed, we had an increase in mounds, which was the opposite of what I thought ahead of time. I was worried that we were going to squish things down and have more flats or pits from rutting, but that didn't happen. I think that reflects the fact that there was frozen ground and the greater mounds on the Danforth site. I don't know this, we're looking into this further, but there were some warmer temperatures while they were operating over there, and it's possible that there was greater slash piling in the trails, which would have created more of a mounded topography when we inventoried it afterward. This study does include whole tree harvest. We had 2 stands also down east that were marked for harvest with the same silvicultural treatment. Both were scheduled to be harvested in 2021, and I do have some photographs from this here. For the one that was harvested, things went very well. We saw minimum site damage, even with the tracked machine and the feller buncher with the whole tree skidding. The ground surface was frozen, and we had good protection of advanced regeneration in gaps. However, this particular site consisted of 2 stands that would be treated, and they occurred on a slight slope. The lower stand was not able to be operated. So this is a photo of me in full COVID compliance with my mask on, standing in a rut from the feller buncher in the lower stand, and that came up to about my hip. And what happened there is that the soils, which were fully saturated with water, just had not frozen. So slightly higher up on the slope, no problem. Down here, not operable. We were just right on the edge of operability. The range in temperatures, as you see here, did include some warmer days, but had the range and the low end similar to the other sites. So I don't know that the soils on this particular site would have generally prohibitive of I don't know that the soils on this site would always prohibit harvesting. That's what I wanted to say. All of our study sites had hydric soils, which are organic soils saturated with water. But those of you who have been working in Maine this winter know that we had an unseasonably warm winter, and we did not have a prolonged period of sub-zero temperatures prior to this operation. And so I think that is what prevented us from operating in this stand. It does raise the specter of concern with climate change. We had some colleagues at the university looking at operational feasibility, and this was in the 2 stands that were cut to length. And what they found is the cost of operations was higher in cedar than nearby non-cedar stands, and that was related to lower productivity. That came from smaller tree size, more logs per handle, more time segregating products, and orienting the logs when loading. They found few if any direct effects of soils on the winter harvesting productivity and cost. It was species alone that made the job less productive. Smaller trees had to mess with turning them around because they're tapered on the end. That's related to cedar growing on lowland sites. It wasn't the site itself. So to summarize, we found that elevated microsites and decayed deadwood were important for regeneration, but layering was common. We're going to hear about that next. Problems with competition were seen in the regenerating stratum, and they were exacerbated by deer browsing. Thinning and small gap creation were operationally feasible, both with cut to length and whole tree systems, but we're worried about climate change. When things got a little warmer, we weren't able to get into one of our stands that was on the wetter end of our spectrum. There was a little negative effect on microtopography from the winter harvest with the cut to length system. We haven't measured it yet for the whole tree stand, but I don't think I'm going to have a problem there either. We did see a loss of stags that wasn't anticipated. More results to come. Stay tuned on that. So I want to end by just taking a couple minutes and going over some work we are doing right now. So this is hot off the press and nobody's heard about this yet, and I pulled together just for you all. So one of these studies is looking at layering, the asexual regeneration. This is happening across Maine, Vermont, and Michigan. Here we looked at the mode of regeneration as in layers or seedlings, or what my colleague calls sproutlings. That would be a layer. So we yanked them out of the ground in a very gentle way to keep all their roots attached and saw whether they were attached to other stems or not. So that's a really exciting project that's going on right now. We're also doing a manipulative study that we call pinning and jamming, where we take branches or stems of small cedar and we pin them to the ground on different substrates with landscape staples still attached to the trees, or we cut them off and shove them in the ground to see what happened. And we're in our 2nd year of that. So that's really exciting. There's also an insect pest on northern white cedar called the arborvitae leaf miner. And whenever you read publications about the pests on northern white cedar, they always say, oh, there's not that many. You know what? This insect is actually a concern. We found in literature from the Maine Forest Service throughout the 20th century multiple reports of leaf miner outbreaks causing browning and death of northern white cedar. And in fact, here we see compiled radial increments from our Penobscot site and another site called Howland that my colleague Sean Fravor and Ruth Van Kampen pulled together. And they found these periods of growth suppression where it was clear something was affecting the cedar negatively. So we got historical data from the Maine Forest Service, and it shows that there were high infestations of leaf miners throughout the state at that time. So this is new. We're working on it right now, and that should be coming out within the year. We've also moved into the topic of climate change, and here I credit the leadership of my colleague Jay Wason. We're looking at the sensitivity of cedar and fir as their primary competitor to droughts and floods, both by measuring water depth and soil moisture in the field and planting cedar in the greenhouse and flooding them or depriving them of water. We're looking at competition, the relative success of cedar and fir seedlings in the stand. We have done this by planting cedar on pits, mounds, and flats and different levels of canopy openness in some of our harvested stands. And we're going out this year to plant more and plant fir as well, so we can see how both species respond to these. And then finally, here's a study that I'm really excited about. We just found out a week ago that we will be working in the next few years with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources on a project that includes a statewide resource assessment of lowland northern white cedar, inventory of more than 160 past harvests on public lands to determine the cedar outcomes, developing silvicultural guidelines, and implementing cutting trials. So please stay tuned for that. So with that, I bring my presentation to an end. I recognize all our funders and thank all of you for taking the time to listen, and I'm happy to take questions if we have a few minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Laura. Thanks, Laura. We have time for 2 questions. There's one there's one in the chat box.
Okay.
From Nancy Patch. Well, what will a lower water table do to climate change due to the composition?
Okay, let me think about that for a second. So if we have climate change effects and we have more of a drought situation, the water table drops. I think what we're concerned about, particularly in the lowland stands, is that they would be more prone to being dried out. So we're talking about a very mossy situation down there. And so if the water table drops and it's drier, what will that do to composition? Well, I suspect the species that are less tolerant of drought are going to be more negatively affected. And already we've seen last summer when I was working in the cedar swamps, sometimes when I sat down, it was really dry and crunchy, which was weird. I think it's going to be hard on species like northern white cedar, which is so shallow rooted. And we do know balsam fir has the ability to put its roots a little deeper. Whether that could happen in the fashion to make it able to survive better, if it can respond that quick, I don't know. But I think that these shallow rooted species on wet sites, you know, you'd say, well, they won't have the seasonal flooding, so maybe that will be better. I'm not sure. I think that they're adapted to the seasonal flooding, and I'm concerned about potential droughts, even on lowland sites in the future. It's that variation that's going to be challenging for them. Yeah.